There is a habit you perform so many times a day that you have stopped experiencing it as a behavior at all. It doesn't look like a habit. It looks like courtesy. It looks like honesty. It looks like a person doing the ordinary decent work of making themselves clear. You send a message, and then you send a second message explaining the first one. You decline an invitation and supply a reason nobody asked for, more detailed than the situation required. You order the thing you actually wanted and hear yourself say, "I don't usually get this." You leave a room early and manufacture a story about the morning. You state an opinion and pad it on both ends. This might be stupid, but at the front, but I could be wrong at the back, so that by the time it arrives, it has already apologized for existing. And you call this being open. You call it being considerate. You call it being self-aware, being easy to work with, being someone who doesn't leave people guessing. But underneath the vocabulary you've assembled to make it sound like a virtue, there is a simpler mechanism running. You are not explaining yourself. You are applying. Every sentence you release with a reason attached is an application for permission to have said it. Every context you volunteer is a document filed in advance of a charge that has not been made. You are not communicating. You are submitting evidence. And you have been doing it for so long that you no longer notice the difference between saying a thing and defending it. This is the habit. Not a single behavior, but a permanent condition of preemptive justification, worn so continuously that it has stopped feeling like something you do and started feeling like something you are. Carl Jung spent his life studying the parts of a person that operate without consultation, the material that runs beneath awareness and arranges a life from underneath it. He observed that the unconscious does not reason with you. It does not present its case and wait for your agreement. It repeats. It takes whatever was never resolved and stages it again, in new clothes, with new participants, in rooms that have nothing to do with the original. He did not call this a flaw. He called it fidelity. A mind stays loyal to the conditions that first taught it what safety cost. You are still paying a price that was set decades ago. Consider what you actually do in an ordinary hour, the way you soften a request before you have finished forming it, the way you attach a because to a sentence that was already complete, the way you narrate your own reasoning out loud so that no one has to wonder about you, so that no one has the chance to arrive at a conclusion you didn't supply. None of this reads as damage, it reads as decency. That is what makes it almost impossible to see. A habit that looks like a virtue is the hardest kind to examine, because no one around you, including you, has any reason to raise the question. Your exhaustion gets mistaken for thoughtfulness. Your anxiety gets mistaken for emotional intelligence. Your compulsive transparency gets mistaken for maturity. People will thank you for the exact behavior that is quietly consuming you, and their gratitude will make it harder to stop. Most people do not outgrow their defenses. They just find better words for them. Somewhere behind you, and it does not matter whether that history was dramatic or entirely unremarkable, you learned that your inner life was not self-evidently acceptable, that it required an argument, that wanting something was not sufficient grounds for wanting it, and that the wanting had to be justified before it could be permitted. Maybe it was a house where feelings were treated as claims that had to be substantiated, where crying prompted the question why, and the question was not curious, it was procedural, and you understood very early that a bad answer would cost you. Maybe it was a parent who could be reached, but only through argument, who was not cruel, only unpersuaded, so that every ordinary childhood need arrived at their feet as a case to be made rather than a fact to be met. Maybe it was simply an environment where being misunderstood was expensive, where a single misread expression could reorganize the temperature of an entire week. And so you learned to eliminate the gap, to leave no space between what you meant and what could be assumed, because the assumption was never in your favor. And then, at some point, it worked. That is the part nobody accounts for, and it is the reason this set as hard as it did. There was a specific afternoon, which you almost certainly cannot recall, when you were small and something had gone wrong, and you produced an explanation. A good one, fast enough, detailed enough, plausible enough, and the temperature in the room dropped. The face in front of you changed. Whatever had been coming toward you did not arrive. You found the lever. Nothing installs a behavior faster than a defense that works on the first attempt, in a body too young to understand that it may have worked by accident, in a room where the alternative was frightening. You did not decide to become a person who explains. You discovered a mechanism that produced safety once, under pressure, and something in you filed it as the mechanism that produces safety, permanently, under every condition, for the rest of your life. Children are not bad at learning. They are catastrophically good at it. That is the difficulty. A child derives the rule from a single trial and then applies it for 30 years without ever running a second one. Whatever it was, a conclusion formed in you before you had the language to inspect it. You decided that you were not obviously allowed. From that point, your presence was conditional, and the condition was coherence. You could stay, you could speak, you could take up the space in front of you, provided you could account for it. And once that conclusion set, it stopped needing the original house to keep operating. It only needed you to keep entering rooms. That decision became a reflex. The reflex became a personality. And the personality became something you now defend, sometimes fiercely, whenever anyone suggests you might not owe the world a running commentary on your own existence. Notice what you did with that last sentence. Something in you had a response to it, a quiet objection assembling itself, a correction being drafted, a small internal voice already halfway through the words, but that's not really me. My situation is different. I do it because. That is the habit. It just ran. It ran in defense of itself, before you had finished the paragraph, using the only tool it has ever had. And this is not a trick of language. It is the most reliable evidence available to you, because a pattern this old does not wait to be invited. It arrives whenever it is named, and it arrives dressed as your own reasonable thinking, which is precisely why it has survived this long without ever being questioned. There is a specific moment where all of this becomes visible, and it is worth slowing down to look at, because the mechanism shows itself more clearly here than anywhere else. You say something plain, I can't come, I don't want to, that doesn't work for me. No. 4 words, sometimes 2. The sentence is complete in every way a sentence is permitted to be complete, grammatically and socially and morally. Nothing further is required from you. And then there is a pause, not a long one, half a second at most, roughly the width of a held breath. The other person has not spoken. Their face has not moved. Nothing has happened, and nothing is happening, and into that nothing, something in you begins to draft. You feel it start. A pressure behind the sentence you just finished, an unfinished quality that has nothing to do with the sentence and everything to do with the silence following it. And before anyone has reacted, before the room has registered a single thing, you hear your own voice continue. Because, and the sentence keeps going, past the point where it was already whole, out into an explanation that was never requested, assembling context, offering background, laying out a reasonable and complete account of why a person like you would say a thing like that. Look at what actually occurred. No one questioned you. No one asked for a reason. No consequence arrived. No expression changed. No relationship shifted. The only thing that happened was internal. A silence appeared, and you experienced it as an accusation. A pause opened, and you filled it with testimony. You were not interrogated. You volunteered. You confessed to a room that had not noticed anything worth confessing. You were answering a question no one asked, from a person who is no longer alive in the form that once asked it. This is where the habit does its real work. Not in the visible moments, not in the long, anxious conversations you can remember afterward, but in these small, automatic additions, hundreds of them a day, each one so brief it never registers as an event. You add a reason. You supply a context. You annotate a feeling before you have finished having it, so that it arrives pre-interpreted and cannot be interpreted against you. Multiply that by every exchange, every day, across years, and you begin to understand why so many people who appear entirely functional describe a fatigue they cannot locate. They are not tired from their lives. They are tired from the running translation they perform before they are permitted to enter them. It is not other people that exhaust you. It is the editorial. And it is not confined to your mind. It has a physical signature, and you have been carrying it so long that you have stopped reading it as information. There is a breath you take before you speak. Not a full one, a half breath, drawn and held, the kind a person takes before going underwater. You do it in meetings. You do it before answering the phone. You do it before saying something as ordinary as no. There is the moment after you send a message, when your eyes go back to the top and read it again, and then a third time, checking not for errors but for tone, for anything in it that could possibly be received as more than you meant. The jaw goes next. Then the shoulders, arriving somewhere near your ears during any conversation that carries weight, and the small hollow drop in the chest after you have said something true and left it unaccompanied, which has never once in your entire life been followed by an actual consequence, and which your body produces anyway, on schedule, every single time. None of this is anxiety in the way you have been using that word. It is preparation. It is a body maintaining, at all hours, the metabolic cost of a defense that has not been required in decades. Standing by, fully staffed, for an event that stopped being scheduled a very long time ago. You have never been tired from your life. You have been tired from readiness. Jung wrote about what he called the persona, the arrangement a person builds in order to move through the social world, assembled out of whatever traits were rewarded and whatever traits were punished during the years when they had no say in it. He was careful about this. The persona is not a lie. Everyone constructs one. There is no version of a functioning adult without some negotiated surface. The danger, he said, begins when a person forgets that the surface is a surface. Your persona was built out of legibility. Where another person learned to hide, you learned to disclose. Where another person built a wall, you built a window, and then you built a plaque beside the window explaining what could be seen through it. You made your interior public so that it could never be discovered, because a thing discovered can be used and a thing volunteered cannot. That was intelligent. It was also the beginning of a problem you have never named, which is that you no longer know how to have a private thought. Not a secret, a private thought. Something that belongs to you, that stays with you, that is not immediately drafted into an argument for your own reasonableness. You have come to believe that this is simply your character. That you are, at the level of who you fundamentally are, an honest person, a communicative person, someone who values clarity, someone who would rather over-explain than be misread. The strategy dissolved so completely into the self that questioning it now does not feel like reconsidering a behavior. It feels like being asked to become dishonest. That is not an accident. That is exactly how a defense of this quality is supposed to work. The mind does not build these things casually. It builds them to persist, to feel necessary, to resist inspection, because a defense you could talk yourself out of in an afternoon would never have protected a child from anything. The resistance you feel right now, reading this, the sense that stopping would make you cold, or evasive, or difficult, or the kind of person who leaves others in the dark, is not proof that the explaining is still required. It is proof of how well it was installed. This pattern does not stay inside you. It has been quietly reorganizing every relationship you have in ways that neither you nor anyone close to you has ever put into words. Think about what your explaining has taught the people around you. For years, you have handed them a finished account of yourself. Your motives, pre-clarified. Your moods, annotated as they occur. Your decisions, delivered with the reasoning already attached, so that nothing you do ever has to be wondered about. You made yourself easy, and the cost of being easy is that nobody has ever had to do the work of knowing you. There is a difference between being understood and being explained, and almost no one who lives inside this pattern has ever been on the right side of it. Understanding is something another person does. It requires their attention, their curiosity, their willingness to sit in not knowing long enough to ask. Explanation removes all of that. Explanation is a service you perform so that their curiosity never becomes necessary. You did not build closeness, you built convenience. And the people in your life have adapted to it exactly the way people adapt to anything that reduces their effort, which is to say, completely, unconsciously, and without malice. If you always give your reasons, no one has to ask for them. If you always announce your state, no one has to notice it. If you always deliver your inner life pre-interpreted, no one has to develop the skill of interpreting you, and over enough years, that skill never forms. They are not withholding it from you. They never learned it, because you never left room. This is the part that rarely gets said out loud. The people closest to you have a quiet, entirely unspoken interest in your explaining never stopping, not because they wish you anything but well. Because your running commentary has been doing a job that would otherwise be theirs, and most people, understandably, do not volunteer for work that someone else has been performing for free for a decade. So when you try to stop, you meet something you were not expecting. You say no and leave it there. You let a sentence stop at its own edge. You allow a silence to sit without filling it with your reasoning, and instead of relief, you meet a low, confused friction in the room, a change in the air, a sense that something has been withheld. That reaction feels like proof. It is not. It is a system noticing that a service has been discontinued, and here is the harder edge of it. You did not merely fail to be known. You actively trained the people around you to expect an account, and then you granted them the standing to expect one. Every unrequested justification was a small transfer of authority. Every volunteered reason established a precedent that your choices are the kind of thing that come with reasons, that your preferences are the kind of thing that come with grounds, that you are a person from whom an explanation is appropriate to receive. Nobody demanded that of you. You issued it. One sentence at a time, you appointed them to a bench they never applied to sit on, and then, when they eventually behaved like judges, when someone asked why in a tone you didn't like, when someone questioned a decision you had already justified 3 times, you felt the injustice of it and could not locate where it came from. It came from you. You wrote the charges. You convened the court. You have spent your adult life being tried in a proceeding you organized yourself. Jung described a process he called projection, in which a person takes something that belongs to their own interior and locates it, convincingly, in someone else. He was not describing a rare pathology. He was describing something that happens constantly, in ordinary rooms, between ordinary people who would never recognize the word. What you have projected is the verdict. The judgment you cannot stop bracing for is not arriving from outside you. It has never arrived from outside you. It lives in you. It has lived in you since you were small, and because carrying it consciously would be unbearable, you have spent decades assigning it to whoever happens to be standing in front of you. The colleague, the partner, the friend, the stranger at the next table. You hand them the gavel, you argue your case, and when they say nothing at all, you experience their silence as a ruling. They are not ruling on you. Most of them are barely thinking about you. The trial is entirely interior, and you are prosecuting it. There is something else here, and it is subtler and worse. The people who benefit most from your explaining are very often the ones who describe you most warmly. You are so easy to talk to. You are so self-aware. You are so honest about where you're at. I never have to guess with you. Those sound like affection. Some of them are. They are also a container. Naming your exhaustion this way is how it never has to be treated as a problem. Explain everything, and nobody ever has to check on you. A person who is always transparent is a person whose opacity would be alarming. You have been praised into a role, and the praise is sincere, and the role is costing you something nobody in it has any reason to notice. Openness that requires no reciprocity is openness nobody has to answer. This is not a conspiracy. Nearly everyone involved is acting in good faith. It is simply the ordinary, mostly unconscious arithmetic by which relationships settle into whatever shape reduces the total discomfort in the room. Once a shape stabilizes, disturbing it costs something, even when the shape has been quietly costing you more than everyone else combined. Which brings you to the particular loneliness that belongs to this pattern. And it is not the loneliness of being misunderstood. It is the loneliness of being fully explained and never once asked. You have told people everything. Your history, your reasoning, your patterns, the things you're working on, the reason you are the way you are. You have been more forthcoming than almost anyone you know, and somewhere underneath all of that disclosure is a fact: you have never let yourself finish thinking. Nobody has ever had to come and find you. There has been no need. You have always come out to meet them, arms full of documentation, before they had taken a single step toward the door. And so, you have never had the experience, not once, of being sought, of someone sitting in the discomfort of not understanding you and choosing to stay in it long enough to ask a real question. The question that never gets asked is the loneliest object in a life, and you removed the conditions under which it could be asked. You did it on purpose, at first, for good reasons, when you were young and the alternative was worse. Then you kept doing it out of habit. Then you kept doing it because it had become the only way you knew how to be near anyone at all. There is a threshold that most people carrying this pattern eventually reach, and it does not announce itself. It rarely looks like insight. It usually looks like a small, unremarkable moment that lands wrong. You finish an explanation. A long one, careful and complete. The kind you are good at. The kind that leaves nothing ambiguous. You have covered your reasoning and your feeling and the context behind both. And the other person says, okay. That's it. Okay. Not dismissive, not cold. Just a person accepting a thing you said and moving on with their evening. And you feel nothing. Not relief. That is the part that stops you. You have just successfully done the thing you have organized an entire personality around doing. You have been received exactly as you intended. The case was made and accepted, and there is no relief anywhere in your body. Only the flat exhaustion of a task completed, and the quiet awareness that you will have to do it again tomorrow and the day after, and that there is no total number of successful explanations that will ever add up to being allowed. That is when the question surfaces, usually somewhere you did not choose. In a car, in a hallway, at 2 in the morning in a kitchen, you have stood in 10,000 times. What would be left of me if I stopped making my case? It is a real question, and it terrifies you, and the reason it terrifies you is not the reason you think. Up until this moment, the habit worked. That has to be said plainly, because most people skip past it and then wonder why nothing changes. The explaining was not a malfunction. It kept you employed. It kept you included. It made you the reasonable one in rooms where being reasonable was the only currency you had. It gave you a role, and roles are stabilizing, even expensive ones, even ones that are slowly emptying you out. But a role built on continuous justification has a shelf life. The parts of yourself you have been managing all this time do not evaporate because you refuse to look at them. The wants you never articulated because you couldn't defend them. The refusals you softened until they became agreements. The preferences you abandoned at the exact moment someone asked why. They accumulate somewhere. Jung called that accumulation the shadow. Everything about a person that was too inconvenient, too costly, or too indefensible to bring into the light, pushed instead into a region of the psyche they stopped consciously visiting. He was clear that the shadow is not the same thing as evil. It is simply unlived. It is whatever got exiled during the construction of a self that other people could tolerate. Almost everyone assumes their shadow is their cruelty. Yours is not. Your shadow is your arbitrariness, the part of you that wants a thing for no reason. That says no because it is a Tuesday and you do not feel like it. That declines without a policy behind the declining. That leaves early because it wants to leave early and has nothing further to add and does not consider the absence of a reason to be a gap in the sentence. That version of you exists. It has always existed. It is not dangerous. It is not selfish. And it is not the thing you were taught it was. It is simply unjustified. And unjustified was the one thing you were never allowed to be. Early on, ordinary human arbitrariness got filed under unacceptable. And you have lived without access to it for so long that its absence stopped registering as a loss. It started registering as your character. Now, the disturbing part, the one most people flinch away from just as they get close enough to see it. The explaining was never for them. Read that again slowly, because everything you have built rests on the opposite assumption. You believe you explain in order to be understood. You believe the audience is external, that the reasons are for other people. that if the room were only more generous or more patient, you would not have to work this hard. That is not what has been happening. You were not making yourself understandable to other people. You were making yourself permissible to yourself. Every explanation you have ever volunteered was a vote cast in a private referendum on whether you are allowed to be here. Not a conversation, a ballot. And you have been holding this referendum continuously, in every room, for as long as you can remember, and you have never once let the polls close. Sit with that for a moment, because it changes the entire shape of the thing. You do not explain because you are afraid of being misunderstood. You have been misunderstood before. It happened, and you survived it. And some part of you knows perfectly well that it is survivable. Being misunderstood is uncomfortable. It is not the emergency your body treats it as. You explain because you have never decided that you are allowed, and explaining is how you avoid ever having to decide. This is the mechanism underneath the mechanism, and it is much stranger than the version you have been telling yourself. As long as the case is still being made, the verdict is still pending. As long as the verdict is pending, nothing has been settled, and nothing settled can be taken away. Your explaining is not a bridge toward other people, it is a delay. It is the sound of a person keeping their own trial permanently open, because a trial in progress is safer than a ruling. Weigh what an acquittal would actually cost you. It would mean the standing is real. It would mean you belong in the room by right rather than by argument. And a thing you hold by right is a thing that can be lost, contested, revoked, and you would have to live inside that exposure without a single sentence available to defend it. Pending is safer. Pending is permanent. You have chosen the endless hearing over the risk of a verdict, and you did not choose it consciously, and you have been paying for it every day since. This is also why the reassurance never lands. People have told you, repeatedly, that you don't have to explain, that it's fine, that they weren't asking, that they never needed a reason. You have received that reassurance hundreds of times from people who meant it entirely, and it has changed nothing, and you have privately wondered what is wrong with you that it doesn't stick. Nothing is wrong with you. The reassurance is being delivered to the wrong address. They are answering a question about themselves. Do we need a reason from you? And the answer, sincerely, is no. But that was never the question your nervous system was asking. Your nervous system was asking a different question entirely, one that no other person is in a position to answer, one that has been asked in the same words since you were small. Am I allowed? No one can rule on that from outside. Not your partner, not your closest friend, not 100 people telling you it's fine. It is not their jurisdiction. It never was, which is exactly why you keep asking them over and over in the form of explanations that cannot possibly resolve it, because a question directed at people who cannot answer it is a question that will never have to be answered. That is not stupidity. That is engineering. The pattern is not failing at its job. Its job was never to get you permission. Its job was to keep the question open, endlessly, safely, at enormous cost, so that you would never have to stand in a room and take your own side. And here is what almost no one tells you about the material you have been guarding. It is not what you were taught it was. The unexplained version of you is not selfish. It is not cold. It is not the difficult, careless, inconsiderate person you have spent your whole life proving you are not. It is simply unaccompanied. It arrives without documentation. It wants what it wants and cannot produce a receipt. The only reason that feels dangerous is that somewhere behind you, in a house you did not choose, a person without a reason was a person who did not get to stay. Underneath all of it, the habit that has been destroying you was never the explaining itself. It was the belief, installed so early that you were never consulted about it, that a version of you with no reason attached is not a version anyone would keep. You have spent decades proving that belief wrong to everyone except the one person who holds it, and you have never tested it directly. Testing it would mean saying a true thing, stopping, and then staying in the room afterward with no word of defense available to you at all, which is, when you look at it clearly, the only experiment that has ever been relevant, and the one you have spent a lifetime arranging never to run. Once you can see the mechanism, you can see where it has been operating, and the reach of it is larger than you are ready for. Start with your work. You over-report. You explain your process when nobody has asked for your process. You justify a timeline before anyone has questioned it. You send the update that preempts the question. You attach the reasoning to the decision. You build a paper trail for choices that were never going to be audited. And you experience all of this as being conscientious. Read what that communicates. Authority is the ability to decide without showing your work. That is nearly the whole of it. The people above you are not smarter than you, and frequently they are not more capable than you. What they have is the willingness to make a call and let it stand without an accompanying document explaining why the call was defensible. You have never let a decision of yours stand alone, and so the room has learned, entirely without cruelty, that your judgment is something that arrives with supporting material, which means it is something that can be evaluated, which means it is not authority. It is submission, dressed as thoroughness. You have made yourself audit-proof, and the price of being audit-proof is being permanently audited. You have wondered why you are trusted with everything and given nothing. That is why. Take your relationships next. The close ones, the ones that were supposed to be different. Somewhere along the way, you confuse disclosure with intimacy, and they are not the same thing. They are barely related. Disclosure is the transfer of information about yourself. Intimacy is the willingness to be seen without controlling the interpretation. One of those you are extremely good at. The other you have never attempted. You tell your partner everything and show them nothing. Every piece of yourself you have handed over arrived pre-framed, pre-contextualized, delivered with the meaning already attached so that no one could assign a meaning you hadn't approved. That is not openness. That is an unusually sophisticated form of control, performed by a person who genuinely believes they are being vulnerable, and it is exhausting for both of you in ways neither of you has been able to name. They do not know you. They know your account of you. And you have been quietly furious about this for years, without ever once suspecting that you were the one who made the substitution. Anger is the next thing to look at. This is the clearest place to see it, because anger is the emotion that refuses to be justified in advance. It arrives whole, immediate, unreasoned. It does not wait for grounds. You have never had access to it. What you have instead is a position. By the time your anger has been made admissible, by the time you have assembled the evidence and confirmed you have a right to it and rehearsed the version that will withstand a challenge, it has cooled into something else entirely. A grievance, a case, a calm, correct, thoroughly documented statement of what was unfair, delivered in a level voice to a person who can feel that something is happening but cannot feel what. You are never angry with anyone. You are only ever correct. And being correct has never once given you what anger was actually for, which is the plain assertion that something crossed a line, made by a person who does not first have to establish the line's legal standing. Solitude is where this gets strangest. This is the one that unsettles people most, because they assume the habit switches off when the audience leaves. It does not. You do not think. You draft. Your private thoughts are addressed. There is a listener in your head, indistinct, permanently present, and everything that occurs to you gets shaped for them before it finishes occurring. You rehearse conversations that will not happen. You compose responses to accusations no one has made. You argue with people who are asleep in other cities. And if you have ever wondered why solitude does not rest you the way it seems to rest other people, this is the reason. You have never actually been alone. You have only ever been unobserved, which is not the same thing, and your body knows the difference even if you don't. Even your physical states get processed this way. You are tired, and before you have finished noticing it, you have accounted for it. It was a long week. You didn't sleep well. The commute. You are hungry, and you check the hour to determine whether the hunger is legitimate. You want to stop working, and you calculate whether you have done enough to have earned the stopping. Rest, in your system, is not a need. It is a reimbursement. You have to submit the receipts first. So at some point, having seen all of this, you try to stop. Everyone in this pattern eventually tries, and what happens next is the reason so many people conclude that they are simply built this way and give up. Every available exit is a version of the same trap. The first thing you try is silence. You stop explaining, deliberately, by force. You give the short answer, you let it be uncomfortable, and it feels, briefly, like power, and then it curdles. Because you are not free of the audience, you have only stopped speaking to it. The withholding is aimed at the same imaginary jury. You are still organized entirely around the verdict, only now you are organized around denying them their evidence. Silence in service of a judge is not freedom. It is the same habit with the sign reversed. The second thing you try is doing it better. You acquire a more sophisticated vocabulary for your interior. You learn the language of patterns and nervous systems and attachment and, yes, the language of everything you are hearing right now. And this is the most elegant version of the trap, because it does not feel like the habit at all. It feels like insight. But listen to what you actually do with the language. You use it to explain yourself with better sources. I'm noticing I'm activated. I think this is my avoidant thing. That's my critical parent talking. Every one of those may be true, and the truth of them is not the point. The point is the sentence they are attached to and the job that sentence is doing, which is the same job it has always done. You have not stopped filing briefs. You have started citing authorities in them. The third thing you try is finding the person who gets it. One person, finally, who understands you without the paperwork, in front of whom you can simply exist, and it works, sometimes for months, and it is the closest thing to relief you have ever felt. Then you notice how carefully you have started managing them, because you have not dissolved the court. You have consolidated it into a single seat. Everything now depends on one person's continued willingness to rule in your favor, which means their bad mood is a constitutional crisis, which means you monitor them with an intensity that will eventually frighten one or both of you. Reducing the number of judges does not reduce your exposure. It concentrates it. The fourth thing you try is deciding not to care. You announce it, sometimes to other people, more often to yourself. You are done explaining. You do not owe anyone anything. Let them think what they want. Notice that this is a verdict. Notice that you delivered it out loud, in the same voice you have always used, to the same audience. A person who has genuinely stopped caring does not need to declare it, and the declaration is the tell. You have not exited the trial. You have only started arguing the other side of it, and you will keep arguing it, at length, to people who never raise the matter, for as long as it takes for the performance to exhaust you. And the fifth thing you try is the most invisible of all, which is asking permission not to explain. Do you want the full context, or is that enough? Let me know if you need more from me. Tell me if I'm over-explaining. Look carefully at what that is. You have taken the one decision that was finally, entirely yours, and handed it back across the table. You did not stop explaining. You asked someone else to authorize the stopping, which means the authority still lives outside you, which means nothing has moved. You have only found a way to keep the proceeding open using fewer words. Every exit leads back in, and the reason is always the same. You keep trying to win the case. None of these attempts fail because you lacked discipline. They fail because they all accept the premise, and the premise is the entire problem. You cannot argue your way out of a courtroom. You cannot go quiet in a way that satisfies a judge who does not exist. There is no performance of not needing permission that is not, itself, a request for permission. The proceeding does not end with a better argument. It ends when you stop showing up to it, and that, unfortunately, is not a decision you get to make once. Before anything else, something has to be said clearly, because most people arrive here carrying a shame that does not belong to them. The adaptation was intelligent. A child in a house where feelings required an argument learned to argue. That is not weakness. That is a young nervous system correctly reading the conditions available to it and building the most effective instrument those conditions allowed. You were not broken by that house. You were educated by it. Given what you had to work with, given the room you were standing in, explaining yourself was not neurotic. It was the smartest available move. The problem was never that you adapted. The problem is that an adaptation, once it succeeds, never audits itself. It does not check back in with you every few years to ask whether the conditions still hold. It does not run an accounting on the energy it consumes. It does not notice that the house closed, that the people who required the argument have aged or softened or died, that every room you now enter is populated by adults with no interest whatsoever in your reasoning. It simply continues, because continuing is the only instruction it was ever given, and nothing you have told it consciously has been persuasive enough to override what it learned in the body before you had language for any of it. Which is why understanding this changes almost nothing on its own. You can follow every word of this. You can agree with all of it, recognize yourself completely, feel the specific discomfort of being described accurately. And tomorrow morning, before you are fully awake, before you have consciously decided anything at all, you will attach a reason to something that did not need one. Understanding a pattern and dismantling a pattern are two different processes running on two different systems. One lives in thought, the other lives in the oldest and least negotiable part of your memory, the part that was recording before you could speak, the part that does not read. But something does shift once you can see it, even though the seeing does not dissolve it. You begin to catch the half-second, that small gap between the sentence that had already finished and the moment the drafting starts, the pressure behind a finished thought, the pull toward because before because has arrived. That gap has been there your entire life, thousands of times a day, and you have never been present inside it, because a reflex that fast does not leave room for a witness. Now there is a witness. It does not stop the reflex. Be honest about that, because most people quit at exactly the point where they expected the noticing to be a cure and discovered it was only a light. The reflex will fire. You will feel the reasons assemble. You will hear yourself add the sentence you did not need to add, and you will hear it while it is happening, which is, at first, more uncomfortable than not hearing it at all. What the witnessing removes is not the habit, it is the habit's authority. Because a pattern that runs completely unobserved does not feel like a pattern. It feels like sincerity. It feels like the truth of who you are, expressing itself. The moment it becomes observable, that changes. It starts to feel like a sentence you are adding. Still automatic, still hard to resist. But a sentence with a beginning and an end and an author rather than the simple sound of your own character. And the distance between a reflex and a sentence, however narrow it looks from here, is the entire distance between a life that keeps repeating itself and a life that begins, slowly, to depart from its own instructions. Jung believed the central work of a life was to make the unconscious conscious. Not because awareness repairs anything directly. He was specific about this. Because what stays unconscious is experienced as fate, while what becomes conscious can eventually be participated in. You are not required to become a different person. You are only required to notice, more and more precisely, the moment the old defense engages without your consent, and to ask whether the room you are standing in has actually asked you for anything. Most of the time, it hasn't. Most of the time you are answering a house that stopped existing years ago, in a body that never received the correction. What follows from this is smaller than you want it to be. There is no practice here that will feel significant while you are doing it. There is only a set of ordinary, unglamorous moments, and they look like this. You let a sentence end where it ended. You say no and stop talking. You let a silence sit without treating it as a question. You decline something and offer nothing after it. You want a thing and say so without first establishing that you have earned the wanting. You say the honest, unaccompanied version of a thought and then remain in the room afterward, with nothing prepared, while your entire body insists that something is about to go wrong. Something will not go wrong. That is the whole experiment, and it is almost insultingly small, and it will not feel like a breakthrough on any of the occasions you manage it. It will feel like a slightly awkward pause, and a strange low hum of exposure that fades within a minute. Then it will happen again the next day, and again, and these will accumulate exactly the way the original pattern accumulated, quietly, without ceremony, one repetition at a time, until at some point you notice that a room did not require the argument it once did, and you cannot say precisely when that stopped being true. There is one more thing worth saying, and it resists being said cleanly, because it does not offer the ending most people are hoping for by the time they reach it. The habit will not simply end. There is no clean morning where you wake up unexplained, no threshold you cross, after which the reasons stop assembling themselves behind your sentences. That version of change is comfortable to imagine, and it is not how any of this actually works. You will feel the old pressure the next time you say something true and unpopular. You will feel the pull to soften it, to context it, to hand someone a reason before they have thought to want one. What changes is not the presence of the reflex. What changes is who it answers to. Because a person who mistakes their defense for their honesty will spend an entire life submitting documents to a court that adjourned before they were old enough to read. A person who can see the defense clearly, even while still feeling every bit of its pull, has one thing the first person does not have: a gap, narrow, unreliable, available only sometimes, and enough. That is not freedom in the way freedom gets sold to you. It is something quieter and considerably more durable. It is the capacity to feel the reason coming and, occasionally, not follow it all the way out of your mouth. You have spent a very long time building a case for a person that nobody in your present life has ever asked you to defend. The room that required the argument closed years ago. The people who set the terms are not in it. There is no one left at the table, and there has not been for a long time, and still every day you stand up and begin again. There is a sentence you have never finished saying, not because anyone stopped you, because you have never once let it end where it actually ended, and stood there and found out what happens next. It is still available to you. It has been available for years. Nobody was ever going to tell you that. Nobody was ever in a position to.